Hello, partners in crime. How are you today? We have with us Patrick H. Moore, crime writer, and he is an Los Angeles-based private investigator, sentencing mitigation specialist, and he's been working in those fields since 2003. He has worked in virtually all areas, including drug trafficking, sex crimes, crimes of violence, and white-collar crime. Plenty of fodder for his crime novels. Welcome, Patrick.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Gina. I
It's
would
great.
make one slight correction. I'm
Yes.
not literally a private investigator. I'm an investigator, and I work for a firm, the owner of which is a private investigator. So I work for a licensed private investigator.
Okay. Well, thanks for telling us about that. Um, Tell me how that background as an investigator has given you the tools with which to write these books.
Okay, that's a good question to start with. I had always been interested in writing,
Mhm.
and you know, and of course, writers come in many ilks and stripes, many different types of writers. And I had, when I was in college, I did mostly experimental writing, which was in vogue then. And I had short stories published in various campus type magazines. And then I wrote an attempt to write something more popular. I had an agent back in the, let's see, it would have been the early 90s. I had an agent for several years who shopped my books around New York with no luck. And, uh, and then I stopped writing for a while. I was in a rock band for a long time. And I did various things. But I always was in the back of my mind, I always was interested in writing. And then it would be 2003, I had the opportunity to take a job as an investigator and sentencing mitigation specialist for a firm in Los Angeles, working for a fellow named John Brown. And so and it's interesting that where I got the job with John Brown, I had written a novel, not a very good one, which actually had aspects of a crime novel. And I
Yeah.
had sent it down to John in Los Angeles. I was living in Northern California, in Silicon Valley at the time. I sent it down to Los Angeles for John to read. And John read it and he liked it. And actually, that indirectly led to him offering me a job with his company, as his right hand man had just left, and to take a soft job in labor relations at UCLA. And so John had lost his right hand man, so he needed someone. So so it was kind of interesting and ironic. To some degree, I got the job with him based on the strength of the novel, which was called Allies, which I had sent down to him. And then years later, actually, I sent the novel to my old agent, who is still alive and kicking. So I sent it to him, and he said, "This is nicely written, but this book doesn't have enough heft." And I had no idea what he meant, heft. And so anyway, but John loved it. And years later, after I'd started to write actual crime novels, I reread Allies and I realized the agent was right. It didn't have enough heft. It was like, half of a story.
Mhm.
Um, and but anyway, that's how I got my job as an investigator and sentencing mitigation specialist. So through that job, I met all sorts of characters,
I can
including
imagine.
some very interesting ones, some less interesting. But when you do dozens and dozens of cases, a couple dozen cases each year, so called 100 cases or more over the course of time, you meet a
Wow.
lot of characters. And so I learned a lot about how law enforcement actually works and how our judicial system works. I learned a lot about federal crimes, as I did mostly sentencing mitigation work for federal cases. What
Mhm.
sentencing mitigation work means is you just have a client, let's say his name is Clyde. And so, and Clyde may be in custody, he may be incarcerated at a detention center awaiting sentencing, or he may not be. So he may be out on bond. And so either way, I would interview him in great detail, and often I would interview his family members as well. I would
Mhm.
collect character letters, so I'd really get to know the person. So then I would write a report, which is known as a sentencing memorandum or a federal sentencing memorandum. And so the memorandum would consist of both the personal side of my client, who he was, where he came from, etc., and also whatever legal arguments were necessary. In some cases, much more complex legal arguments are necessary than in other cases. In many cases, the legal arguments are fairly simple. So it just depends on the case. And of course, for some attorneys, they would just have us write the personal side, and they would write the legal side themselves, though not necessarily that well, as it's kind of like a specialty niche, and lawyers don't usually like to write that much, or at least criminal defense lawyers. So anyway, so that's how I got started, and I met a lot of interesting characters, and some of the most interesting characters I met early on in my career.
So you brought this up that you do mostly federal cases. Is there a significant difference between federal and non-federal cases and how you handle them?
Great question, Gina. And there's a small but significant difference, and most people don't understand this. And like you always hear, like, people complain, well, so and so is getting more time for fraud than Uncle Joe got for committing a murder, who got off scot-free or whatever. And that's where the basic misunderstanding lies. Federal cases and other cases have virtually nothing in common as far as how they're handled, and typically as far as what type of cases they are. So you have federal cases over here and you have state cases over here.
Mm-hmm.
So most crimes of violence are state cases. Very rare, not very rare, but somewhat rare for federal cases to be crimes of violence. Federal cases, as you mentioned, it's mostly drug crime, certain amount of sex crime, and lots of fraud cases.
Okay.
Whereas state cases are typically not fraud cases. And, I'm making these distinctions, but there are always exceptions to the rule. Yeah. A good example, and there's a tremendous difference between the way that the state law enforcement handles cases and the way the feds do. For example, in Los Angeles County, the county sheriffs or the LAPD or whoever, oftentimes they will arrest people with large amounts of drugs or large amounts of money. And they don't necessarily prosecute them. As often as not, they just let them go and keep an eye on them, or try to get them to work for them as informants, or that sort of thing. But oftentimes they don't prosecute them. And there are various reasons for that. As far as, whereas the feds, when the feds come after you, they only come after you after doing a real investigation, and they collect lots of evidence, sometimes mountains of evidence. So by the time they either indict you or inform your attorney that you are a target, a person of interest, they've got everything they need to convict you, typically. And because of that, in federal court, the vast majority of defendants do not go to trial. Defendants that do go to trial in federal court, 97% of them are guilty. The jury finds them guilty in 95 to 97% of the cases. So in other words, the feds build their cases really carefully. Whereas state stuff, imagine a murder's been committed. Like we've all read dozens of crime novels in which a murder has been committed, and there's tremendous rush. They want to catch the guy. They want to get the perpetrator. And so they're under tremendous pressure to get the perpetrator and get him or her fast. And as a result of that, there's a tendency on the state level to, arrest minorities just because, it's convenient, or they were somewhere near where the crime took place or whatever, without solid evidence. So therefore, in state court, lots of people go to trial and they either hang the jury or they're acquitted. Whereas in federal court, that's very rare.
Oh, wow. So Nick Crane is your PI that is the base main character in your thrillers. How does he play into what you've just shared with us?
Okay. Well, Nick Crane, of course, Nick Crane is a fictional character. He's a bit larger than life.
Yeah.
And but so he works as a licensed private investigator.
Okay.
And he has an office in Los Angeles, and he lives in the suburbs in the San Gabriel Valley, which is James Elroy country, which is directly east of downtown Los Angeles. And so Nick is a licensed private investigator. And so as a licensed and private investigator, he does investigations. He also does work for attorneys. Sometimes he does sentencing work for
Okay.
attorneys. And, but he will do federal cases or state cases or just private cases. Someone comes to him with a problem. They have a missing loved one or that sort of thing. And of course, the way the Nick Crane series started out 10 years ago is the original case. There was indeed a missing loved one. And
Hmm.
so Nick had to try to track down the missing loved one, which he eventually did. And so in that case, the first Nick Crane novel, Cicero's Dead, the way my friend BJW Nash came up with the title Cicero's Dead, which it was a good title in the book. I indie published it 10 years ago. I sold
Yeah.
it cheap as dirt, as people sometimes do with their indie novels, and it really sold very well.
Wow.
And it was one of the first lessons I learned when I got traditionally published a few years ago. It's much harder to sell books when you're traditionally published than when you're indie published, because when they're traditionally published, the books are expensive and people want a bargain. In fact,
Hmm.
I'm considering I may go back to indie publishing going forward. I haven't decided. I don't really want to, as it's fun being traditionally published and you don't have to do much work. But as far as book sales, if you're indie publish, you just go with KDP Select and you can, do giveaways, and it's all very convenient and easy to do. So anyway, that's an interesting thing. But anyway, so Nick Crane, the first book, Cicero's Dead, was much more like a conventional PI novel, more like a mystery with some thriller elements.
Okay.
And then as the character developed and the way Nick has developed over the past few years, Nick at this point lives in a really dangerous world. You might say a dystopian or fallen world. Um, the world that Nick lives in is similar to the way, in my opinion, the world actually is for a great many people. Of course, polite middle class people like ourselves, we don't tend to live in that world, and it's very interesting. And this is it's a bit of a bone I would have to pick with a lot of crime novels of today. I was just a judge for this year's Seamus Awards
Yeah.
for the hardback category. And we received about 35 books to read. About 25 of them fit into the category. It's funny, my judges they were bears on whether or not this book really fits in the PI category. I was less concerned with that. But anyway, so I read 25 books, and of the 25, say 5 to 10 were, quite good. 5 were really good. But I noticed like the books are so soft. It's like, even if there's, a murder investigation or something, the whoever the protagonist is, if it's first person, he's cracking a lot of jokes, and it's all like fun and games. And so the crime genre, to some degree, whatever, say 100 crime novels are published, maybe 60 or 70% of them are fun and games. And maybe the other 20 or 30, are perhaps to be taken seriously. So
Hmm.
as the character of Nick Crane developed, I did not want to simply write escapism like so many of my peers do. And that's not to say all of them. And the escapist novels and the crime, man, they're fine books. I'm not at all arguing about the quality of the writing. I'm more concerned with, what are you going to write about? And in my mind, here we have a nation on the brink of disaster. Things are going haywire nationally, no matter, whether one's politics are to the right or to the left or to the center. Most people will admit, if they think about it, things are not so good. Something is wrong in America. And, and so my later Nick Crane novels, 27 Days and
Yeah.
Rogues and Patriots, they, depict this somewhat fallen or dystopian world in which Nick is always in danger. He's fighting for his life. Bad people are after him. And so there's a whole trilogy of the second, third, and fourth Nick Crane novels are a trilogy in the story Nick Crane versus the Principals. And the Principals are an unsavory group of very wealthy, aristocratic, alt-right, quote, super patriots.
Yeah.
And it's Nick's bad luck. They've come after him. And the reason they've come after him is years ago, Nick was hired by a woman named Carolyn Best.
Mhm.
Carolyn Best had a schizophrenic son, Peter Best. And Peter Best's best friend had vanished. And so Carolyn Best hired Nick to find her schizophrenic son's best friend, a fellow named Lou Hernandez. And so it was a typical PI novel in which your job is to find someone.
Yeah.
And so Nick finally did find the missing young man, Lou Hernandez. And in the process, he tracked down the abductor, the kidnapper, who was a man named Frank Constantine. Frank Constantine was a military psychiatrist. He was also from a wealthy, aristocratic East Coast family. He was a military psychiatrist, and he was doing original research in the area of what he called gentler, kinder torture research. The idea being that he believed torture was necessary for our, international policies, but that the torture should be as gentle and kind as possible. So it's a kind of, there's a kind of oxymoron going on there. And so anyway, excuse me, it turns out, just a moment. It turns out that Frank Constantine, in addition to being a highly respected and well-funded military psychiatrist doing gentler, kinder torture research, he was also a serial killer of women. And women's strangled nude bodies would be found in dumpsters and in various parts of Los Angeles County. So Nick and his team, his crew, they tracked down Frank Constantine. And the young man, Lou Hernandez, escaped. And in the meantime, Frank Constantine had abducted Carolyn Best, who had hired Nick.
Mhm.
And so she also escaped. Everyone escaped. And unfortunately, Frank Constantine would not surrender. And because he was, had a lot of pedigree and a lot of, wealth and powerful supporters, if he had surrendered, maybe he could have, avoided the penitentiary with, a plea of insanity or, that sort of thing. But he refused, and he had a pipe bomb. He was going to blow everyone to kingdom come. But Frank Constantine's handyman, a guy named, I can't remember his last name, Hank someone,
Mhm.
shot him and killed him with a Ruger pistol, semi-automatic. And so Frank Constantine died. So the way the present stories begin is 8 years later, Nick is abducted by a man who says his name is Miles Amsterdam and a woman named Tammy Wheat and
Mhm.
and their helper Oliver Tragg. And that's the setup in Rogues and Patriots. You just held up the book.
Yeah.
And so the reason that Miles Amsterdam comes after Nick all these years later is because Miles, he's kind of, over the course of time, events have transpired in his life. And if you've read the story, he kind of, he slowly but surely becomes progressively more unhinged. And it
Yeah.
turns out that Frank Constantine was his best friend all through his childhood. They went
Mhm.
to fine private prep schools together. They played sports together. They did boating trips together. They did everything together. And because Frank Constantine was a military psychiatrist, he also became Miles Amsterdam's psychiatrist. And then when he's killed, so Miles has no psychiatrist. His psychiatrist is dead. And so he blames Nick for this. Also, at the time when Nick and his team did bring Frank Constantine to justice, even though they were just trying to arrest him, not kill him, that was somewhat accidental. Nick and his team had found Frank's gentler, kinder torture records in a safe house on the edge of Benedict Canyon in a deserted house, or
Mhm.
the deserted house. And so Nick and his team, they absconded with the gentler, kinder torture records to use them as evidence, which was a mistake. They should have known better because it's federal property, because Frank Constantine was a military psychiatrist. And so And so they have, Nick, to some degree, they have potential criminal charges against him. Miles Amsterdam and his cronies. Now, Miles Amsterdam, that's not his real name. His real name, as we discover in the course of the book, is Thomas Quincy, and he's changed his name because of a disaster that happened to him in Al Anbar province in Iraq during the Al Qaeda Iraq awakening in 2006, 2007. Frank, who was he was a JAG, but he was really a man of the people. Miles Amsterdam / Thomas Quincy, he really, in many ways, he was a heroic person who became unhinged due to circumstances. And that's following and it's just kind of a model for a crime novel. Your bad guy should be, in theory at least, should be formidable and should have good qualities as well as bad qualities. His good qualities should be such that if he wasn't bad, if he hadn't become unhinged, he actually would be probably an admirable person, just like your protagonist, perhaps. But so anyway, that's how the whole story begins. The trilogy. I'm writing the third book in the trilogy now, which is called tentatively Giant Steps. And in the third book, Nick will either get the best of Thomas Quincy, who has now been replaced by his friend Margarita Ferguson, who in Rogues and Patriots goes by the name Tammy Wheat, but she's actually Margarita Ferguson, and she becomes Nick's adversary after Thomas Quincy is arrested and he's kind of out of the picture. And so that's the setup. And so in the third book, Giant Steps, Nick will either, hopefully Nick will find a way out of this mess and will be able to bring them all to justice. We don't see it in Rogues and Patriots, but in the second book of the trilogy, 27 Days, which was actually published first, yes, Nick actually forms a surprising alliance with a young progressive special agent in the FBI, a woman named Carrie North. And so that's, yes, 27 Days. And so in 27 Days, Nick actually, to his surprise, Nick's not a big fan of law enforcement, even though he has an uneasy relationship with law enforcement, because Nick is kind of fast and loose with the rules himself. But he basically, he has his standards, he has his code of honor. Nick would never execute a man. He would never shoot a man in the back. He would, shoot it out in self-defense. And there are plenty of gunfights in these stories. But, he has honor. He would never murder a man, never shoot a man in the back, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's kind of the setup for the Nick Crane versus the trilogy, versus the Principles trilogy, which I'm working on book 3 now.
And Nick Crane has been called a throwback to the classic American PI. So in addition to his moral compass, what other aspects do you see that coming from?
Okay, yeah, he's been called a throwback to the classic American PI, and that's true to some degree, but to some degree it's not true. If we look at the classic American throwback, and I've just read this last couple of weeks, I read 4 Jim Thompson novels. And of course, I'd read Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. And one thing about let's just look at Marlowe and Raymond Chandler. Marlowe, he's like Nick in that he's strong, independent, and determined. Right. But Marlowe is not like Nick in that Marlowe is he's an unhappy loner type of person. Marlowe has no real friends. Or if he does have friends, they're few and far between. And it's interesting. What's the last Raymond Chandler Marlowe novel, The Long Goodbye, which I reread recently about a year ago. In it, Marlowe actually has a male friend. And the male friend is a troubled alcoholic. And Marlowe has real human feelings for him. And the friend kind of vanishes, and Marlowe is very sad. So it's like, poor Marlowe, it's sort of pathetic in a way. The classic American, he wants a friend, but he can't really find a friend. Whereas Nick has very close friends. And
Hmm.
Nick is, by the time of Rogues and Patriots in 27 Days, Nick is
Yeah.
divorced because his wife, who's a fine woman, Cassidy Walker, the fact that Nick is his life is so dangerous and violent, and they have a child, and she just at a certain point can't take it, and so she leaves. She regretfully leaves Nick. It's interesting because I'm sure you're acquainted with the James Lee Burke Robichaux novels, but in the James Lee Burke Robichaux novels, his protagonist, Dave Robichaux, he's been married a couple of times, and his wives keep getting killed. One of them is murdered by the bad guys, and the other one gets killed in a wreck. In fact, I have the book right here. It's a fairly recent. Can you see that?
Yeah.
It's a fairly recent James Lee Burke Robichaux novel just called Robichaux. And in it, he's investigating the death of his second wife. And so in my own stories, I was aware of that James Lee Burke and his, Robichaux's wives and such. And I had to decide, well, how do I want to handle, do you want the family to constantly be in danger? That is the family of the protagonist. And I thought for the most part, I didn't. And I thought it's just, it's not, and once again, my favorite crime writers like James Lee Burke say, these books are somewhat, even though they're written to be realistic, they're somewhat hyper realistic. They're somewhat larger than life. And so my books are too. But, I just didn't want Nick to have a wife and child in constant danger, even though there's some elements of danger at times. But, so I made that choice that poor Nick is he's a divorced man or in the process of getting divorced. And of course, that in a certain sense is a positive thing because then he's free to have affairs with women should he happen to meet someone.
Hmm.
Whereas if he's a married man, then there's a moral and ethical issue there. And so as far as my protagonist and affairs, I kind of like the model that Lee Child uses in the Jack Reacher novels. That is, in the Jack Reacher novel, Jack Reacher really has, he's far from being obsessed with women, but he likes women. And typically he'll have a relationship. In each Reacher novel, he will have a relationship with a woman, but it won't be like the main thread or thrust of the story. It'll be
Hmm.
somewhat incidental to the story.
So the principals and Nick Crean, what is it about this series that you love so much that you've written the series?
Okay, good question. I don't know that I love it so much, but I wanted to write, and I'm glad you asked the question. I wanted to write a novel or a series of novels in which the stakes are really high. That, in other words, the principals, who basically consist of Margarita Ferguson
Yes.
slash Tammy Wheat, Miles Amsterdam slash Thomas Quincy. Those are two of the four main principals. They are really bad people. They are in the process of destroying America and destroying democracy to the best of their ability. Margarita Ferguson, her goal is to build private prisons, to fund and build private prisons all over America in which to lock up migrants, Muslims, Mexicans, non-white Americans. The
Hmm.
principles are, kind of archaic in a way. They're like old-fashioned racist Americans who want America to be a white country,
Okay.
which, of course, it's probably absurd everywhere, but it's especially absurd in Southern California, where a quarter of our population is, probably half our population is combined Asian and Latino or, something like that. So we truly live in a melting pot here. And that's part of the reason I think, much of the country views California as this weird place is because, California is very much of a melting pot, and especially Southern California. And so I tried to create, so really two things. I wanted something mysterious to be going on,
Yes.
and this is the idea why are the principals after Nick? And I had to figure that out, because when
Mhm.
I started out, I just had these, these bad guys were after Nick. And I had to come up with a convincing reason as to why they were. So I
Right.
had to create the whole scenario about Frank Constantine as a serial killer of women and all of that, and Nick bringing him to justice, which is how he gained the wrath of the rest of the principals. And so I wanted the stakes to be high. Nick's not particularly political at all. If you wanted to put him politically on the spectrum, it's probably kind of a moderate. But Nick, believes in, that people should be, that our nation should be like a nation where people can be free and independent, and where people have, rights and opportunity, and where they're not being controlled by a group of ultra rich, ultra alt-right super patriots behind the scenes. And so Nick is kind of thrust into this situation where he's fighting for his life against these people. And he's not at all happy about it, but he's there, and he's fighting for his life. And fortunately, he has his allies. He has his business partner and close friend, Bobby Moore, who's based on a
Mhm.
real life Vietnam veteran I was very close friends with. And his friend Tony Bott, who is an LAPD narcotics detective. So in that sense, so Nick both is and he is not a throwback.
Yeah.
Kind of personality wise, he is, but he's a much more like modern sort of fellow. He would never refer to women as dames or, nothing like that. You know, his ex-wife would certainly would have clobbered him if he had. And so it's interesting. One of 27 Days, one of the reviews that of 27 Days done by like a professional reviewer,
Yeah.
um, talked about how Nick was actually, he had more Jason Bourne in him than he did the old fashioned throwback, because Nick is, he, like he has in his eye, he is his database expert, he uses technology. Nick himself is no expert in it, but,
Mhm.
he certainly, so it's not like he's like a guy with a fedora and a gun, stalking around the murky streets of Los Angeles. Another difference is, you know, if you were to go back and read um, the Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe novels, or Dashiell Hammett, I reread The Maltese Falcon lately,
Oh, yeah.
and Sam Spade, he's not a very nice man,
Right.
and either is Philip Marlowe. Nick Crane is he's like a normal guy. He likes sports. He likes to work out. He, he has a lot of very normal, friendly qualities about him, even as he's very rough, tough, and courageous. And Nick also, there is an element, the word psychotic is not the right word, but Nick had a disastrous and very difficult childhood. He
Yeah.
had no mother, he had an alcoholic, abusive father. And so, because of that, Nick was stalked by danger, really in the form of his own father. As a young boy, by the time Nick was 10, 12 years old, he was, sleeping with with a knife under his pillow, just for protection against his father if necessary. And so Nick has a quality where danger stalks him, or he stalks danger, or it's kind of a symbiosis of sorts going on. And so he's kind of, and he wishes he wasn't in that position, but he is in that position.
Yeah. Wow. So,
And one other is like quick note on that. And so
yeah.
that's why Bobby Moore, his very close friend, Bobby Moore is had severe PTSD. He was a
Mhm.
Vietnam veteran.
Yeah.
And so Bobby Moore, so Nick and Bobby, they're like troubled individuals who do the best they can to get by, to walk through life, even as they're dealing with all these very difficult problems. But but they're good people, and they're not loners, and they do play fast and loose with the regulations at times. And you were going to ask a question, Gina. Sorry, I
No,
interjecting.
it's fine. I love hearing about this. And Bobby and Nick's relationship and the kind of people that they are and continue to be throughout the series. Because they grow, but they're very much the same.
Well, I think, and that's an interesting issue in writing genre fiction.
Yeah.
In the difference between literary fiction, or a difference between literary fiction and genre fiction. And I intended in my life to be a literary writer. And then I became a genre writer later in life, and I realized that it was a great deal of fun. And the great advantage of being a genre writer is you can actually tell lively stories
Mhm.
with relative ease.
Yeah.
Whereas a literary writer, you're supposed to you know, write realistically about real life. And we've all lived for a while. We've lived real lives. And real lives consist of real lives are not necessarily that exciting all the time. In fact, they're usually probably not, at least mine. I can't speak for anyone else. And like what I do for entertainment now that I'm semi-retired, I'm older and semi-retired, I go to the basketball court for entertainment. But it's not the sort of thing that, leads to a novel. And so, but in literary fiction, you have lots of room for character development. In fact, characters are supposed to develop. They're supposed to start out over here and end up over here. Whereas in genre fiction, the characters, even though they will develop in certain ways, certain aspects of them, but
Yeah.
they remain in other ways, as you pointed out, somewhat the same. It's like, let's just take Lee Child. It's like Jack Reacher's always the same. You go through, I haven't read all the 25 books or whatever, but I've read, 5 to 7 of them. And old Jackie's always the same guy. Now, my character, Nick Crane is somewhat like Jack Reacher in that he's quite indomitable, physically very courageous, and is a very tough character. But the difference is Jack Reacher is really a very two-dimensional character. There's not much room for emotion. Jack Reacher, when he has to wipe people out, he, doesn't think twice about it. He just, if he has to kill somebody, he just kills them. I remember I read the first Jack Reacher, I was startled. He actually, kills about 10 people in a closed room and he nails them all to the wall. And it was a truly grisly scene, but it was just, it was truly over the top.
Yes.
And so even though I try to write exciting, hyper realistic stories, I try not to make them over the top to that degree. But so Nick Crane is like Jack Reacher in terms of his physical courage and indomitable quality, but he's much more human. It's like Jack Reacher would never be married or divorced or whatever. He would never even come close to getting married.
Yeah. So when you're doing the marketing for these books, um, are you taking, you said the first one was Cicero's?
Now, Cicero's Dead was 10 years ago, and it was
Yes,
indie published.
right. So we can't get that one?
Oh, sure. It's on Amazon, of
It
course.
is? Okay.
Yeah,
And
a lot of people like Cicero very much.
mhm,
People may be more comfortable with Cicero than they are with these later books. Because in Cicero, Nick is more, he's a family man. He's got a wife and kid.
right.
And it's a typical missing person crime novel. And the reason I made, Nick's character actually did change between Cicero's Dead and 27 Days. In Cicero's Dead, Nick was in no way like a desperate character, whereas he is now a desperate character fighting for his life, as he's been for 2.5 books now. The third book, Giant Steps, I'm close to being finished with it. And after that, I don't know what I'll do. Will I dust off? Well, will I write and like a one-off, or I'm not sure what I'll do. I may choose completely different protagonists. I haven't decided. The main job is finishing Giant Steps. So I'll eventually have a 300,000 word trilogy, Nick Crane
Wow.
versus Principles. So this, and if I, who knows how long I'll live if I don't live that much, this will be my life's work, will be the Nick Crane trilogy.
So will this
But
third
it's
book
something
be,
that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
will the third book also be released by Down and Out?
I'm struggling with that. I love the people at Down and Out, but they're a small publisher. They publish a great many crime writers, and they don't have a marketing budget. So we basically do all our own marketing. With the difference being, if I were indie published, I can set the prices myself,
Yeah.
and it would be much easier to sell books. There's a reason that like Sister is Dead, I sold something like 8,000 copies, something like that. It did really well,
Mhm.
relatively speaking, for an unknown, indie published novel. So, but I probably will stay with Down and Out for Giant Steps, and then after that, decide what I'm going to do.
It's amazing. What kind of other marketing do you enjoy doing? Where can we find you?
Well, I don't enjoy doing marketing at all. And in that sense, I probably shouldn't even be writing in the modern world where writers are required to do their own marketing, or, you
Yeah.
know, typically are. But I mean, and Down and Out, the book is on all the platforms. It's on Barnes and Noble, it's on Kobo, it's on all of them. And of course, it's on Amazon, and it's available in both paperback and a e-version. And I can be reached at my website, patrickhmoorewriter.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And
I will go ahead.
go ahead, Gina.
Yeah. Well, it's time to wrap up. So I will put the links to your website in the show notes. And is
Oh,
there
please
anything else
do.
you want to leave with our listeners?
Only that I really enjoyed the interview. I love your style, and I
Thanks.
just really enjoyed doing this. And to and the link did you send me a link from which I'll be able to access the podcast? Because I'll put it up on my TikTok and on my Instagram and on all the various websites. I
Yes,
can
and I
be
will
found
send
on
it to
I
you
mean,
again.
I am on TikTok and Instagram and
Mhm.
Facebook and X, though I don't use X much these days.
You
I've
are all
recently
over the place.
well, I mean, like most writers are, they're on all of them. TikTok is actually fun because
Is it?
it's very accessible. It's very much like the way Twitter used to be.
Yeah. All
So,
right. Well, thank you so much. And look for the links in the show notes and check out his books. And you don't want to miss these Nick Crane thrillers.
well, thank you very much, Gina. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.